The corner of determination. The sun had not yet risen, but the air in the tiny apartment was already heavy. Marcus sat quietly at the edge of his bed, careful not to wake his two younger brothers, who were tangled in the single blanket they shared. Their peaceful faces were a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts running through his mind. He glanced toward the door of his mother's room. The sound of her coughing echoed faintly, breaking the stillness of the early morning. The sound had become all too familiar, cutting through him like a dull blade every time it reached his ears. Marcus inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the weight pressing against his chest. He slipped on his worn sneakers, the soles so thin he could feel the floor beneath his feet. Slowly, he padded into the tiny kitchen, where the last of their lemons sat in a small bowl on the counter. They were far from perfect, speckled, and starting to soften, but he couldn't afford to waste them. He took one in his hand, rolling it on the counter to soften it further. His small hands, calloused and cracked, worked methodically, a skill honed by weeks of this morning ritual. The sharp tang of citrus filled the air as he sliced into the lemon, squeezing out every precious drop into a bowl. He added water, sugar, and stirred. His movements were careful and precise, despite his fatigue. "Marcus," a weak voice called from the doorway. His mother leaned against the frame, her frail body wrapped in a threadbare robe. She looked paler than usual, her hollow cheeks accentuated by the dim light of the kitchen. "Morning, Mom," Marcus said, turning to give her a reassuring smile. He didn't want her to worry more than she already did. "What are you doing up so early, baby?" she asked, though they both already knew the answer. "Getting the lemonade ready. I'll be back by lunchtime," he replied, pouring the mixture into an old glass jar. He wiped his hands on a dish rag and turned to her, trying to appear confident and steady. She took a shaky step forward and cupped his face with her hand. "You're too young to be worrying about all this. You should be out playing, not working." Marcus felt his throat tighten but forced a smile. "It's okay, Mom. We need this. I'll do whatever it takes." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded slowly, pulling him into a weak hug. "Just be careful, and don't stay out too long. It's going to be hot today." "I will," he promised, grabbing the jar, a stack of plastic cups, and the makeshift stand he had fashioned out of an old wooden box. Outside, the city was starting to come alive. The faint hum of cars and distant chatter of early risers filled the air. Marcus headed to his usual spot, a bustling corner near the market. It wasn't prime real estate, but it was what he could manage without attracting too much attention. He set up his stand, 2 bricks with a wooden plank balanced on top, just sturdy enough to hold the jar and cups. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Marcus wiped the sweat already forming on his brow and called out, "Fresh lemonade. 50 cents a cup." His voice was small but steady, carrying through the noise of the street. Hours passed, and the city grew busier. People hurried by, their faces set in determination as they navigated their own struggles. Some glanced at him, but kept walking, their minds elsewhere. Others offered polite smiles but didn't stop. Marcus tried not to feel discouraged. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Finally, a woman with a shopping bag slowed her pace and approached his stand. She looked at the jar, then at Marcus. "How much?" she asked, her tone curious but kind. 50 cents, ma'am," Marcus said, standing a little straighter. She dug into her purse and handed him 2 quarters. He poured her a cup with careful hands, making sure not to spill a drop. She took a sip and nodded approvingly. "This is good, kid. You make this yourself?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, Mom. Thank you." She smiled and walked away, leaving Marcus with a small sense of accomplishment. He pocketed the coins and scanned the crowd, calling out again, "Fresh lemonade." The hours dragged on, and the sun grew relentless. Sweat soaked through Marcus's shirt, but he didn't stop. By midday, his pocket held only a few dollars, not nearly enough for his mother's medicine. He counted the coins over and over, willing them to multiply. His throat felt tight, but he refused to cry. There was no time for that. A group of boys from school strolled by, their laughter carrying over the noise of the street. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were the kind of boys who never worried about anything beyond the next video game or soccer match. One of them, tall with messy hair, stopped when he saw Marcus. "Hey," the boy said, smirking. "What are you doing here?" "Just selling lemonade," Marcus replied, his voice barely audible. The boy snorted. "Why? You broke or something?" Marcus clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He didn't answer, knowing it would only make things worse. The boy laughed and nudged his friends, who joined in, their mocking laughter ringing in Marcus's ears as they walked away. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing the anger and shame aside. He couldn't afford to waste energy on them. He turned back to his stand and called out again, "Fresh lemonade. 50 cents a cup." His voice cracked, but he kept going. As the day wore on, Marcus felt his strength fading. His legs ached from standing, and his throat was dry from calling out for hours. He was on the verge of packing up when he spotted a familiar figure walking down the street. Mrs. Taylor, his fifth-grade teacher, was heading toward him, her usual beige cardigan draped over her shoulders. "Marcus," she called out, her voice tinged with surprise. He froze, a mix of embarrassment and relief washing over him. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor," he said, forcing a smile. She approached his stand, her eyes scanning the setup. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Just selling lemonade," he replied, avoiding her gaze. She frowned. "Why? Shouldn't you be at home more?" Marcus hesitated, then sighed. He didn't want to explain, but he knew she wouldn't let it go. "My mom's sick," he admitted. "We need money for her medicine." Mrs. Taylor's expression softened, her eyes filling with sympathy. She knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, "you're such a brave boy. Is there anything I can do to help?" He shook his head quickly. "I'm okay, ma'am. I just need to sell more lemonade." Her brow furrowed, but she nodded, sensing his resolve. "All right, Marcus. But just know, you're not alone, okay? I'll see what I can do." Marcus tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "Thank you, Mom." She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before walking away, her steps brisk and determined. Marcus watched her until she disappeared around the corner, a small flicker of hope stirring in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, things would get better. He turned back to his stand and called out once more, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "Fresh lemonade. 50 cents a cup." The weight of resilience. The sun rose with a vengeance the following day, its golden rays cutting through the thin curtains of the apartment. Marcus was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with his head resting on his hand. He had spent the entire night tossing and turning, the weight of his responsibilities pressing on him like a heavy stone. The coins he'd earned the previous day sat in an old glass jar on the counter, taunting him with their inadequacy. He glanced toward his mother's room. Her coughs had been quieter that morning, but he knew better than to take that as a sign she was improving. He'd overheard the doctor say her condition would get worse without consistent treatment, and the cost of her medication was more than Marcus could imagine saving. Yet he had to keep trying. Standing up, he grabbed the last few lemons from the bowl. They were shriveled and dry, barely suitable for lemonade, but it was all he had. He rolled them under his palm with extra force, hoping to squeeze out every last drop. As he prepared the mixture, his younger brothers wandered into the kitchen, still rubbing the sleep from their eyes. Jamal, the older of the two, plopped into a chair and yawned loudly. "You're up early again," he said, his voice tinged with worry. "I've got to make more lemonade," Marcus replied without looking up from his work. "You two make sure Mom's okay while I'm gone, all right?" Jamal nodded solemnly, while little Terry climbed into Marcus's lap, wrapping his small arms around him. "Do you have to go?" Tarek asked, his voice muffled against Marcus's chest. Marcus hugged him tightly before gently setting him down. "I do, buddy. But I'll be back before you know it." Their small voices tugged at his heart as he grabbed the jar, the cups, and his makeshift stand. Before leaving, he peeked into his mother's room. She was still asleep, her face peaceful but pale. "I'll make it work, Mom," he whispered before heading out. The air outside was already thick with heat as Marcus trudged to his usual corner. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. There was no time to think about his own needs. He reached the spot and set up the wooden board and bricks, carefully arranging the jar of lemonade and the cups. "Fresh lemonade, 50 cents a cup," he called out, his voice cutting through the early morning quiet. The first few hours passed without much success. A man in a suit walked by, glancing at Marcus briefly before hurrying on. A woman with a stroller gave him a polite nod, but didn't stop. Marcus tried not to let it bother him. But with every passing moment, the weight of his task grew heavier. By mid-morning, the street began to fill with more people. A middle-aged man wearing a faded baseball cap approached the stand. He looked at Marcus, then at the lemonade. "How much, kid?" 50 cents, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady. The man fished $1 out of his pocket and handed it to Marcus. "Keep the change," he said, taking a cup and walking away. "Thank you, sir," Marcus called after him, his heart lifting slightly. Moments like these were rare but invaluable. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus's small victories began to pile up. A young couple stopped to buy 2 cups. An elderly woman purchased one and slipped him an extra quarter. Marcus counted his earnings at intervals, the clinking of the coins in his pocket a small reassurance that he was making progress. Around noon, Marcus noticed a boy from school heading toward him. It was Ryan, a classmate who was known for his kindness, but rarely spoke to Marcus. Ryan was walking with his mother, who spotted the stand first. "Isn't that your friend from school?" she asked, tilting her head toward Marcus. Ryan nodded and tugged on her sleeve. "Let's buy some lemonade," he suggested, walking over. "Hey, Marcus," Ryan said with a grin. "This looks good. Can we get 2 cups?" Marcus nodded, grateful for the friendly interaction. He poured the lemonade carefully, handing the cups to Ryan and his mother. As they drank, Ryan's mother looked at Marcus with a curious expression. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share. "A little while," he said quietly. "Just trying to help my mom." Ryan's mother's face softened. "Well, you're doing a great job," she said, slipping a $5 bill into Marcus's hand. "Keep the change." Marcus's eyes widened. "Thank you, ma'am. I really appreciate it." Ryan smiled at him, giving a small wave as they walked away. Marcus watched them go, feeling a mix of gratitude and envy. He didn't begrudge Ryan his comfortable life, but he couldn't help wondering what it would be like to have that kind of support. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus's energy began to wane. The sun was relentless, and he had run out of water to drink hours ago. His voice was hoarse from calling out, but he kept going. He couldn't afford to stop. "Fresh lemonade, 50 cents a cup." The words had become automatic, almost robotic, as he tried to summon the strength to keep moving. He glanced at the jar of lemonade. It was more than halfway empty, a good sign, but still not enough. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out, "Marcus." He turned to see Mrs. Taylor approaching, her face filled with concern. She was carrying a small shopping bag, her pace quick and determined. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor," Marcus said, trying to muster a smile. She looked at him closely, her eyes scanning his flushed face and tired posture. "You've been out here all day, haven't you?" Marcus nodded. "I'm okay, ma'am. Just trying to make enough." Mrs. Taylor frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Marcus, this isn't something you should be doing alone." "I'm fine," Marcus insisted, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "I can handle it." She sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out a small water bottle. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "You need to stay hydrated." "Thank you," Marcus said, taking the bottle gratefully. He drank deeply, the cool water soothing his parched throat. Mrs. Taylor hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about how I can help. I talked to a few of the other teachers, and we're going to figure something out. You don't have to do this by yourself." Marcus blinked, unsure how to respond. "Really?" She nodded. "Really. But for now, promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay?" "I will," Marcus said, his voice soft. "Thank you, Mom." Mrs. Taylor gave him a reassuring smile before heading off, leaving Marcus with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. He glanced at the coins in his pocket and then at the jar of lemonade. The day wasn't over yet. He could still make a difference. As the sun began to set, Marcus packed up his things and headed home. His feet ached, and his shoulders were sore from carrying the heavy jar, but his spirits were lighter than they had been that morning. He had earned more than he expected, and with Mrs. Taylor's promise of help, he felt a small spark of hope igniting within him. When he entered the apartment, his brothers ran to greet him, their laughter filling the small space. His mother, sitting up on the couch, gave him a tired smile. "How was it today?" she asked. "Better," Marcus said, sitting beside her. He placed the jar of coins on the table. "We're getting closer, Mom. I promise." She reached out and took his hand, her grip weak but comforting. "You're doing so much, baby. More than I ever could have asked for." Marcus nodded, leaning against her shoulder. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't walking it alone. Unseen struggles. The morning sky was a mixture of soft blues and grays as Marcus prepared for another day at his corner. The faint smell of lemons lingered in the air as he sliced the last 2 fruits he had left. He worked mechanically, squeezing out every drop into the bowl. The juice was barely enough to fill half the jar, but it would have to do. His brothers, Jamal and Tarek, sat on the floor playing with the only toys they owned, a pair of battered toy cars that Marcus had salvaged from a dumpster months ago. Their laughter filled the tiny apartment, providing a bittersweet contrast to the weight pressing on Marcus's young shoulders. He looked at them for a moment, feeling the familiar sting of guilt. They deserved more, a better home, toys that weren't broken, and a life free of the constant worry that hung over them all. "Marcus," his mother's weak voice called from her room. He quickly wiped his hands and walked to her door. She was sitting up, her body propped against a stack of mismatched pillows. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her face was pale, but she managed a small smile when she saw him. "You don't have to go today, baby," she said softly. "We'll manage somehow." Marcus shook his head, stepping closer. "It's okay, Mom. I've got everything ready. I'll be back before lunch." She sighed, her eyes glistening. "You're too young to be carrying all this, Marcus. You should be out playing with your friends, not worrying about medicine or bills." "I'm okay, Mom," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'll make enough. I promise." She reached out, her frail hand brushing his cheek. "You're a good boy. Just be careful out there, okay?" "I will," he said, forcing a smile. He kissed her forehead and stepped back, grabbing the jar and the cups before heading to the door. The streets were quieter than usual when Marcus arrived at his corner. The air was heavy with humidity, and dark clouds loomed on the horizon, hinting at rain later in the day. He set up his makeshift stand, balancing the wooden plank carefully on the bricks. His jar of lemonade looked pitifully small, but he held on to the hope that it would be enough to get through the day. "Fresh lemonade, 50 cents a cup," he called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. An older man with a newspaper tucked under his arm stopped first. He was a regular customer, and Marcus greeted him with a polite smile. The man handed over 50 cents, took his cup of lemonade, and gave Marcus a small nod before continuing on his way. A few more people stopped throughout the morning, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope with each coin that dropped into his pocket. By noon, He had made about $7. Not much, but enough to buy some bread and milk for his brothers. He wiped the sweat from his brow and scanned the street, hoping for more customers. The sound of laughter caught his attention. A group of teenagers was approaching, their voices loud and carefree. Marcus recognized one of them immediately, Andrew, a boy from school who had a reputation for causing trouble. Andrew was flanked by two other boys, both older and bigger than Marcus. "Hey, look who it is," Andrew called out, smirking as he spotted Marcus. "The lemonade kid." Marcus's heart sank, but he kept his eyes on the jar in front of him, pretending not to hear. Andrew and his friends sauntered over, their smirks widening as they inspected Marcus's stand. "How's business?" Andrew asked, his tone mocking. "Fine," Marcus replied quietly, keeping his voice steady. Andrew snorted. "Fine, huh? Bet you're rolling in cash with this setup." He leaned closer, peering at the jar of lemonade. "How much for the whole thing?" "It's 50 cents a cup," Marcus said, avoiding eye contact. Andrew grinned, pulling a crumpled dollar from his pocket. "Here's $2. Give me the whole jar." Marcus hesitated, glancing at the jar. Selling the whole jar would leave him with nothing for the rest of the day. "I can't do that," he said firmly. "I need it to sell more." Andrew's grin faded, replaced by a scowl. "You serious? I'm giving you more than it's worth." "It's not about that," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly. "I need to keep selling." Andrew's friends laughed, and one of them nudged the jar with his hand, causing it to wobble precariously. Marcus grabbed it quickly, his hands shaking. "Relax, man," Andrew said, holding up his hands in mock innocence. "We're just messing around." They lingered for a few more minutes, taunting Marcus before finally walking away. Marcus let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden plank. He felt the sting of humiliation, but forced himself to focus. There was no time to dwell on it. The clouds began to darken as the afternoon wore on. The air grew heavier, and a few fat raindrops splattered onto the pavement. Marcus glanced at the sky, frowning. Rain would mean fewer customers, but he couldn't afford to pack up yet. He needed to make at least a few more dollars before heading home. A woman with a stroller stopped next, her face kind and curious. "How much for a cup?" she asked. 50 cents, Mom," Marcus replied. She handed him $1 and waved off the change. "Keep it," she said, taking a sip of the lemonade. "This is really good. Did you make it yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, his chest swelling with pride despite his exhaustion. She smiled warmly. "You're doing a great job. Keep it up." Her words lingered in his mind as she walked away. It wasn't often that people acknowledged his effort, and her kindness gave him a small boost of confidence. As the first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, Marcus decided it was time to pack up. He had earned about $12, still far from enough for his mother's medicine, but better than nothing. He carefully poured the remaining lemonade into the gutter and stacked the bricks and wooden plank. Just as he was about to leave, a familiar voice called out, "Marcus." He turned to see Mrs. Taylor hurrying toward him, her beige cardigan flapping in the breeze. She was carrying a small box, her expression one of determination. "Mrs. Taylor," Marcus said, surprised. She reached him, slightly out of breath. "I've been looking for you. I wanted to give you this." She handed him the box, and Marcus opened it cautiously. Inside were several cans of soup, a loaf of bread, and a small envelope. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mrs. Taylor, I can't." "You can. And you will," she interrupted gently. "This is from me and a few of the other teachers. We wanted to help, even if it's just a little." Marcus's throat tightened as he stared at the contents of the box. He didn't know what to say. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice cracking. Mrs. Taylor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing so much, Marcus, but you don't have to do it all alone. We're here for you." Her words pierced through the walls Marcus had built around himself. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten ever so slightly. As she walked away, Marcus stood there in the growing rain, clutching the box tightly. The storm might have been brewing above, but inside, he felt a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile light in the darkness. A storm of change. The rain had grown heavier as Marcus made his way home, droplets pelting the cracked pavement and soaking through his thin shoes. He clutched the box Mrs. Taylor had given him tightly, shielding it as best he could from the downpour. Each step was slow and deliberate, the weight of his exhaustion and the events of the day pressing down on him. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. By the time he reached the apartment, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Marcus fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling from the cold and fatigue. Finally, the door creaked open, and he stepped inside, greeted by the warm, familiar smell of home. Though faint, it carried a mixture of spices and the mustiness of their old furniture. Jamal and Tariq ran to greet him, their faces lighting up as they spotted the box in his hands. "Marcus, what's that?" Jamal asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Marcus set the box down on the rickety kitchen table and smiled faintly. "It's from Mrs. Taylor and some of the other teachers. They wanted to help us out." Tariq climbed onto a chair, peering into the box with excitement. "There's bread and soup. Can we eat some now?" "Later," Marcus said gently, ruffling Tariq's hair. "First, let's check on Mom." The boys nodded and followed Marcus into their mother's room. She was sitting up, her frail body wrapped in a blanket. Her face lit up when she saw Marcus, though it was clear she was tired. "Hey, baby," she said softly. "You're soaked. You need to change before you get sick." "I will," Marcus replied, setting the box at the foot of her bed. "Look what Mrs. Taylor brought for us." Her eyes widened as she took in the contents of the box. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. That's so kind of her." "She said the teachers want to help us," Marcus added, sitting beside her. "Maybe things will get better soon." His mother nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. She reached out and cupped his face with her trembling hand. "You're doing so much, Marcus, more than any boy your age should have to. I'm so proud of you." Her words filled him with warmth, though the burden of responsibility still lingered. He knew that while the box and the kind gestures were a blessing, they were only temporary. He needed to find a way to make things sustainable, to ensure that his family wouldn't have to keep living on the edge of survival. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the soft light of dawn. Marcus was up early again, preparing what little lemonade he could manage with the leftover sugar and water. He hadn't told his mother, but the truth was they had run out of lemons. The jar held only water mixed with the last bits of juice he could squeeze from the rinds. As he stepped outside, his brothers called after him. "Can we come with you today?" Jamal asked, his eyes pleading. Marcus shook his head. "Not today, guys. It's too wet outside, and you need to stay here and help Mom." Jamal's face fell, but he nodded. Tariq clung to Marcus's leg, his small arms wrapping tightly around him. "Be careful," he said softly. "I will," Marcus promised, prying Tariq's hands loose and giving him a quick hug before heading out. When Marcus reached his corner, the streets were unusually quiet. The aftermath of the storm had left a chill in the air, and most people seemed to be staying indoors. He set up his stand anyway, his determination unwavering. "Fresh lemonade. 50 cents a cup," he called out, his voice carrying through the stillness. The first hour passed without a single customer. Marcus shivered as the damp air seeped through his thin clothes. His stomach growled, but he ignored it, focusing instead on calling out to the occasional passerby. Finally, a man in a heavy coat stopped. He looked at Marcus and then at the jar, his brow furrowing. "How much for a cup?" he asked. 50 cents, sir," Marcus replied, straightening up. The man reached into his pocket and handed over 2 quarters. Marcus poured the drink carefully, feeling the man's gaze linger on him. "You out here every day?" the man asked as he took a sip. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, "just trying to help my family." The man nodded, a hint of admiration in his expression. "Keep at it, kid. You've got a good head on your shoulders." "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, pocketing the coins. As the day wore on, Marcus's earnings grew slowly but steadily. By midday, he had made about $5. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was starting to think about packing up when he noticed a car pull up across the street. It was an older sedan, and out stepped Mrs. Taylor, holding a large grocery bag in her hands. "Marcus," she called, waving as she crossed the street. "Mrs. Taylor," Marcus said, surprised to see her. She reached his stand, her face bright with a warm smile. "I thought I'd stop by and bring you something. It's not much, but I figured it might help." She handed him the bag, and Marcus peeked inside. It was filled with fresh lemons, a bag of sugar, and even a small stack of disposable cups. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Mrs. Taylor, I don't know what to say," he stammered. "You don't have to say anything," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You're inspiring more people than you realize." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he nodded. "Thank you," he managed to whisper. Mrs. Taylor stayed for a few minutes, chatting with Marcus and helping him prepare a fresh batch of lemonade. Her presence drew the attention of a few more customers, who stopped to buy cups and offered encouraging words to Marcus. By the time the sun began to set, Marcus had earned more than he had in weeks. His pocket jingled with coins, and his heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. He packed up his stand and headed home, his steps quicker and more confident. When he walked through the door, his brothers ran to greet him as usual, their laughter filling the small apartment. His mother was sitting on the couch, her face lighting up when she saw him. "How was it today?" she asked. Marcus grinned, pulling the coins from his pocket and dropping them onto the table with a satisfying clink. "Better than ever," he said. His mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to hug him. "You're amazing, Marcus. Absolutely amazing." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope. Hope for a better future, not just for himself, but for his family. And as he lay in bed that night, listening to the soft breathing of his brothers, Marcus realized that no matter how difficult the journey, he would keep going. Because they were worth it. Because his mother was worth it. And because deep down, he knew he could make a difference. A community awakens. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of light rain tapping against the window. The sky was overcast, casting the small apartment in a dim gray light. Despite the gloomy weather, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared for the day. He glanced at the grocery bag filled with lemons and sugar that Mrs. Taylor had brought the day before. It wasn't just supplies. It was hope, a tangible reminder that he wasn't as alone in this fight as he had thought. His brothers were already awake, their laughter echoing through the apartment as they played in the living room. Marcus peeked into his mother's room and found her asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in weeks. He smiled softly, relieved to see her resting. Grabbing the supplies, Marcus set to work in the kitchen. He squeezed the lemons, their fresh, tangy scent filling the air. For the first time, he had enough ingredients to make a full batch of lemonade. The bright yellow liquid swirled in the jar, and Marcus felt a small spark of pride. When Marcus reached his corner, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The streets were quiet, but he wasn't deterred. He set up his stand with practiced precision, arranging the jar and cups neatly on the wooden plank. "Fresh lemonade, 50 cents a cup," he called out, his voice clear and steady. The morning passed slowly. A few people stopped to buy lemonade, but most hurried by, shielding themselves from the rain. Marcus kept calling out, his resolve unwavering. He knew that every coin counted. Every sale brought him closer to easing his family's struggles. Around midday, a small group of people began to gather near the corner. At first, Marcus didn't pay them much attention, assuming they were just waiting for a bus or meeting up with friends. But as the group grew larger, he realized they weren't just passing by. They were coming to see him. "Marcus," a familiar voice called out. He looked up to see Mrs. Taylor standing at the front of the group, a warm smile on her face. Behind her were several other teachers, a few parents, and even some of his classmates. They were holding signs that read, "Support Marcus," and "Lemonade for a Cause." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor stepped forward, her smile widening. "We've been inspired by you, Marcus. Your determination and hard work have touched so many people. We wanted to do something to help." One of the parents handed Marcus an envelope. He opened it cautiously, his hands trembling. Inside was a collection of bills and coins, more money than he had ever seen in one place. His eyes widened in disbelief. "This is from the community," Mrs. Taylor explained. "We've been raising funds to help your family. It's not just for today. We're going to make sure you get the support you need." Marcus's throat tightened, and he struggled to find words. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." The group began buying cups of lemonade, each person paying far more than the 50 cents Marcus was charging. Some handed him $5 bills, others gave 10 or 20. The jar quickly filled to the brim, and Marcus had to empty it into a larger container that one of the parents had brought. As the afternoon went on, more people arrived. Word of Marcus's story had spread through the neighborhood, and it seemed everyone wanted to show their support. A local news crew showed up, their cameras capturing the scene as people lined up to buy lemonade and donate to the cause. "Marcus," a reporter said, kneeling down to speak with him, "can you tell us why you started selling lemonade?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at the crowd around him. He felt a wave of nervousness, but took a deep breath and answered, "My mom's been sick, and we didn't have enough money for her medicine. I just wanted to help." The reporter smiled gently. "And it seems like you've inspired a lot of people along the way. How does it feel to see so many people coming together for you and your family?" Marcus looked around at the crowd, his chest swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "It's amazing," he said softly. "I didn't think anyone would notice, but I'm so thankful." The reporter nodded and stood, turning to address the camera. This young man's story is a testament to the power of resilience and community. If you'd like to help Marcus and his family, donations can be made at the neighborhood community center. By evening, Marcus's stand was completely sold out. He sat on the curb, his hands trembling as he counted the money in the envelopes and jars. It was more than he had ever dreamed of, a sum that could cover his mother's medicine for months, pay for groceries, and even take care of the overdue rent. Mrs. Taylor sat beside him, watching as he carefully organized the bills and coins. "You've done something incredible, Marcus," she said. "You didn't just help your family, you brought this community together." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Without everyone." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You reminded us all of what really matters: kindness, determination, and never giving up. You should be proud of yourself." When Marcus returned home that night, his brothers ran to greet him as usual, but this time, he had more than just a few coins to show them. He sat down with his mother, placing the envelopes and jars on the table. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "It's for us," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "The community came together. They wanted to help." His mother's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the money. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You've done so much for us. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," Marcus said, his own tears spilling over. "We're going to be okay now, Mom. We're going to be okay." That night, as Marcus lay in bed, He thought about everything that had happened, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. He realized that while life would always have its challenges, there was strength in community and in himself. He didn't just sell lemonade. He changed his family's future, and in doing so, he discovered the power of hope. A ripple of hope. The weeks following the community's rally around Marcus and his family were transformative, though not without their challenges. Marcus no longer had to wake up before dawn to squeeze lemons, but his days were still full. Between school, caring for his younger brothers, and helping his mother with her medical appointments, his schedule was relentless. Yet, for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt bearable. The outpouring of support had allowed Marcus's mother to start a new round of treatment. The medicine was expensive, but effective. Her coughs grew less frequent, and her energy slowly returned. While she wasn't yet back to her old self, the improvement was visible, and Marcus clung to the hope that things would continue to get better. One Friday afternoon, Marcus returned home from school to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of pride and determination. "Hey, baby," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been thinking. It's time for us to give back." Marcus tilted his head, confused. "Give back? Mom, we still have a long way to go. We need to save what we have." His mother nodded, her eyes soft but firm. "I know, and we will. But we're not the only ones who've struggled, Marcus. This community came together for us when we needed it most. It's time we start thinking about how we can help others." Marcus frowned, unsure of how to respond. He thought back to the nights he had spent worrying about rent, groceries, and medicine. They were still far from secure, but his mother's words stayed with him. They weren't as alone or as desperate as they once were. And maybe that did give them something to share. The following weekend, Mrs. Taylor stopped by their apartment with an idea. Inspired by Marcus's story, she and a few other teachers had started a project called Lemonade and Hope. The goal was simple: to support other struggling families in the neighborhood while teaching kids about resilience, hard work, and community. "We'd like you to be a part of it, Marcus," Mrs. Taylor said, her voice warm. "Your story is what inspired this. We think you'd be the perfect person to help lead the initiative." Marcus's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm just a kid." "You're not just anything," Mrs. Taylor replied firmly. "You've shown strength and determination that most adults would struggle to match. People look up to you, Marcus." His mother chimed in, her voice steady. "You've already made such a difference for us, baby. Imagine what you could do for others." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about the families he had seen around the neighborhood. People who, like his family, were just trying to make it through each day. He thought about the kids who might be going to bed hungry or waking up to the same worries he had carried for so long. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With Mrs. Taylor's guidance, Marcus became the face of the Lemonade and Hope initiative. They started by hosting small lemonade stands around the neighborhood, each one run by local kids eager to help their families or others in need. The proceeds went to a community fund, which was used to cover things like groceries, utility bills, and school supplies for struggling families. Marcus quickly became a local celebrity. The story of his resilience and the community's response had spread beyond their neighborhood, drawing attention from nearby towns and even a few local news outlets. People came from all over to buy lemonade and donate to the cause. Some brought their own stories of struggle, while others offered their skills, time, and resources to help. One day, as Marcus was manning a stand outside the community center, a woman approached him. She was dressed in a simple but elegant coat, and her expression was a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Are you Marcus?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, standing up a little straighter. "Would you like some lemonade? 50 cents a cup." She smiled, handing him a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change," she said. "I've been following your story, and I just wanted to say how inspiring it is. You've done something incredible here." "Thank you," Marcus said, his cheeks flushing. He still wasn't used to the praise. The woman hesitated, then added, "Have you ever thought about what you want to do when you grow up?" The question caught Marcus off guard. For so long, his focus had been on surviving the present that he hadn't given much thought to the future. He looked down at the jar of lemonade, then back at the woman. "I want to keep helping people," he said simply. "I don't know how yet, but I want to make sure no one has to go through what my family went through." The woman's smile widened. "I think you'll do exactly that." As the months passed, Lemonade and Hope grew into something far bigger than Marcus had imagined. The initiative expanded beyond lemonade stands, hosting workshops on financial literacy, community gardening projects, and even tutoring programs for kids who needed extra help in school. Marcus became a symbol of resilience and hope, his story inspiring others to step up and make a difference in their own communities. At home, things continued to improve. His mother's health stabilized, and she even began working part-time at the community center, helping to organize events and connect families with resources. Marcus's brothers thrived, their laughter and joy a constant reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. One evening, as Marcus sat on the couch with his family, he looked around the room and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were still living in the same small apartment, but it felt different now. Brighter, warmer. They had hope, not just for survival, but for a future. His mother leaned over and kissed his forehead. "You've done so much for us, Marcus," she said softly. "You've given us a second chance." Marcus smiled, leaning back against her. "We all did it together, Mom." Years later, Marcus stood in front of a crowd at the grand opening of the Lemonade and Hope Foundation's first community center. He was older now, his face more mature but still holding the same quiet determination that had driven him as a child. The crowd cheered as he stepped up to the podium, the sound of their applause filling the air. "As a kid, I didn't know if we ever make it out of the struggles we faced," he began, his voice steady and clear. "But what I learned is that no one has to face those struggles alone. When we come together as a community, we can overcome anything." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus smiled, his heart full. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. His story wasn't just about lemonade. It was about resilience, kindness, and the power of hope. And it was only the beginning, a legacy of light. The opening of the Lemonade and Hope Foundation marked a new chapter in Marcus's life, but it was far from the end of his journey. The small brick building was modest but functional, with brightly painted walls adorned with murals depicting community and growth. A plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to resilience, kindness, and the power of hope. Marcus Johnson, founder." Standing in front of the building that day, Marcus felt a swell of emotions he could barely contain. The crowd around him, full of familiar faces and new ones alike, buzzed with excitement. His mother stood beside him, her strength returned after years of treatment and care. She looked radiant, her face filled with pride, as she watched her eldest son address the crowd. "This center is more than just a building," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. When I was just a kid selling lemonade, I thought my world was small, defined by the corners of my struggles. But this community showed me that we're never truly alone. Together, we can overcome anything." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Marcus stepped down from the podium, overwhelmed but grateful. He had spent years working toward this moment, building not just the foundation, but also the trust and connections that made it possible. The center would be a hub for food distribution, educational workshops, after-school programs, and even small business mentoring. Everything Marcus had wished for as a young boy trying to navigate life's hardships. The next steps, the months following the grand opening, were a blur of activity. Marcus threw himself into the work, managing the foundation's programs while balancing his studies. He had enrolled in a community college, where he was pursuing a degree in nonprofit management, a choice that felt like the perfect extension of the work he had already begun. Each day brought new challenges, but Marcus thrived under the pressure. He was surrounded by a team of dedicated volunteers, many of whom had been inspired by his story. Mrs. Taylor was one of them, serving as the center's education coordinator. Her steady guidance and belief in Marcus had been a cornerstone of his success, and she continued to be a source of wisdom. "You've got a gift, Marcus," she told him one afternoon as they organized supplies for an upcoming food drive. "Not just for leading, but for making people believe in themselves. That's rare." Marcus smiled at her, humbled. "I'm just trying to do what you did for me, Mrs. Taylor. You showed me I wasn't alone." She patted his shoulder. "And now you're doing the same for others. That's how change happens, one person at a time." The challenges of growth. While the foundation was growing rapidly, the journey wasn't without setbacks. One day, Marcus received an email that left him feeling deflated. A grant application he had spent weeks working on had been denied, leaving a significant gap in the center's funding for the next quarter. Without it, some of the programs would need to be scaled back. Marcus sat in his small office, staring at the computer screen. The weight of responsibility bore down on him. He thought about the kids who relied on the after-school program, the families who depended on the food pantry, and the small business owners who were taking their first steps toward financial stability. Cutting services felt like a betrayal of everything the center stood for. He reached out to his mother that evening, seeking her advice. She listened carefully, her eyes thoughtful. "You've faced harder days than this, Marcus," she said gently. "Remember when we didn't even know if we'd have food on the table? You found a way then, and you'll find a way now." Her words reignited the spark in Marcus's heart. The next day, he called an emergency meeting with his team. Together, they'd brainstormed solutions, hosting a community fundraiser, reaching out to local businesses for sponsorships, and launching a social media campaign to raise awareness. The fundraiser, aptly named Hope in Every Cup, was a resounding success. Hundreds of people showed up, many of them bringing their own stories of how the foundation had helped them. By the end of the evening, they had raised enough money not only to cover the funding gap, but to expand their programs further. A ripple effect. As the years passed, the Lemonade and Hope Foundation became a beacon of light for the community. Its impact rippled outward, touching lives in ways Marcus had never imagined. The kids who once attended the after-school programs grew into young adults, many of them inspired to give back in their own ways. One such young man, Eric, approached Marcus during a community event. Eric had been a shy, withdrawn boy when he first started coming to the center, struggling with both academics and self-confidence. Now he stood tall, his face filled with determination. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you. If it weren't for this place, I don't know where I'd be. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "You did the work, Eric. All we did was give you a little push." Eric shook his head. "No, you gave me hope. And now I want to do the same for others. I'm starting college next month. Education major. I want to be a teacher, like Mrs. Taylor." Hearing this, Marcus realized that the foundation's mission had grown beyond just helping people. It was creating leaders who would carry the torch forward. A vision for the future. Years later, Marcus stood on the stage of a national nonprofit conference, addressing an audience of hundreds. He was no longer the shy boy selling lemonade on the corner. He was confident, articulate, and filled with a vision for the future. "Change doesn't come from one big act," he told the crowd. "It comes from small, consistent efforts. Acts of kindness, moments of resilience, and the belief that even the smallest voices can make a difference. When I was 10 years old, I thought selling lemonade was the only way I could help my family. But that small act became the foundation for something so much bigger. And I believe that every one of us has the power to create those ripples of change." As the crowd rose to their feet in applause, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had started with lemons, but it had grown into a legacy of hope, resilience, and the power of community. Epilogue. Back in his hometown, the original Lemonade and Hope Foundation Center still stood, bustling with activity. Marcus often visited, taking time to mentor the next generation of leaders. On one such visit, he noticed a young boy setting up a small lemonade stand near the entrance. "What's this?" Marcus asked, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "I'm raising money for my friend's mom," the boy said shyly. "She's sick, and I want to help." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He handed the boy a crisp $10 bill and ruffled his hair. "Keep going," he said. "You're already making a difference." And as Marcus walked away, he couldn't help but feel that the cycle of hope and kindness he had started so many years ago was now firmly rooted, growing stronger with each passing day. Beyond the corner. Years later, Marcus sat in his modest but tidy office on the second floor of the Lemonade and Hope Foundation headquarters. The organization had grown exponentially, expanding beyond the borders of their small neighborhood into other underserved communities across the state. The walls of his office were lined with photos, snapshots of children laughing at after-school programs, families receiving meals at food drives, and smiling volunteers working together to rebuild lives. Each image was a testament to how far they had come. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see Mrs. Taylor, now retired but still deeply involved with the foundation. She carried a folder in her hands and wore a smile that had grown no less warm over the years. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping into the room without waiting for an answer. "For you?" "Always," Marcus said, standing to greet her. Mrs. Taylor placed the folder on his desk and gestured for him to sit. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the first page. It was a proposal for a national partnership with a major nonprofit organization that focused on combating poverty and food insecurity. The proposal outlined plans to take Lemonade and Hope to a national level, potentially impacting millions of lives. Marcus blinked, his heart pounding as he read through the details. This is huge," he said, looking up at Mrs. Taylor. She nodded. "It is, and it's a direct result of everything you've built, Marcus. They approached us because they believe in what we're doing, because they believe in you." For a moment, Marcus was speechless. He thought back to his humble beginnings on the corner, the makeshift lemonade stand, and the small jar of coins he had once clung to as his lifeline. He never could have imagined that those tiny steps of determination would lead to this. "What do you think?" Mrs. Taylor asked, her eyes searching his face. Marcus set the folder down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I think it's time," he said. "Time to take what we've learned here and share it with the world." The national stage. Within a year, the partnership was formalized, and the Lemonade and Hope Foundation began opening centers in cities across the country. Each new location was modeled after the original, a hub for resources, education, and community building. Marcus traveled frequently, visiting new sites and meeting with local leaders to ensure the foundation's mission remained rooted in compassion and empowerment. At one such event in Chicago, Marcus stood in front of a crowd gathered to celebrate the opening of their newest center. Among the attendees was a boy who reminded him of himself. Skinny, with big, hopeful eyes and a quiet determination that belied his young age. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the boy approached Marcus, clutching a handwritten note. "Mr. Marcus," the boy said shyly, holding out the note. "This is for you." Marcus knelt to accept the paper, unfolding it carefully. The note read, "Thank you for helping kids like me. One day, I want to help people too." Marcus smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are," he said, "just by being here today." A personal milestone. As the foundation grew, so did Marcus's personal life. His mother, now fully recovered, became a vital part of the foundation's leadership team, managing outreach programs for families facing medical hardships. Jamal and Tariq, now teenagers, volunteered regularly, teaching younger kids and helping with community events. The foundation had become a family effort, a shared legacy born from their shared struggles. One evening, as they gathered for dinner at their childhood apartment, now renovated thanks to the foundation's success, Marcus made an announcement. "I've been thinking about what's next for us," he began, looking around the table. "And I want us to move into a bigger place." His mother raised an eyebrow, though her smile betrayed her excitement. "Bigger?" "Marcus, this place has been our home for so long." "I know," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "But it's time, Mom. You deserve more space. The boys need their own rooms. And I've found a house nearby. It's perfect for all of us." The boys erupted into cheers, and even his mother's reluctance gave way to joyful tears. "You've done so much for us, Marcus," she said, taking his hand. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible." Marcus squeezed her hand. "We've done it together, Mom." The global impact. As the years went on, Lemonade and Hope began to reach beyond national borders. Partnerships with international organizations allowed them to bring their model of community empowerment to underserved regions worldwide. Marcus found himself in places he had only read about as a child: villages in Africa, rural towns in South America, and refugee camps in the Middle East. Everywhere he went, he saw the same struggles and the same resilience. In one Kenyan village, Marcus met a young girl named Amina who had started her own version of a lemonade stand, selling fruit juices to raise money for school supplies. Her small stand was a beacon of hope for her community, much like Marcus's had been all those years ago. "You remind me of myself," Marcus told her, smiling. "And I know you're going to do amazing things." Amina grinned, her confidence infectious. "One day, I'll have a big building like yours," she said, pointing to the newly opened center behind him. "You will," Marcus said firmly. "And I'll come back to visit it." A legacy secured. By the time Marcus reached his 40s, the Lemonade and Hope Foundation had become a global movement. Marcus stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting the dedicated team he had built to carry the mission forward. His focus shifted to mentoring young leaders, ensuring that the next generation would continue the work with the same passion and integrity. One quiet evening, Marcus returned to the corner where it had all begun. The street had changed over the years. New shops and restaurants had replaced the old, worn-down buildings, but the memories remained vivid. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the boy he had been, the struggles he had faced, and the journey that had brought him here. A tap on his shoulder startled him. He turned to see a young girl holding a lemonade cup, her smile wide. "Are you Mr. Marcus?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "I am," he said, smiling back. "And you must be one of the kids from the new center." She nodded eagerly. "My mom says you're a hero." Marcus crouched down to meet her gaze. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "I'm just someone who didn't give up. And neither should you." As the girl ran off, her laughter filling the air, Marcus stood and looked up at the sky. The corner had been the start of everything, but it was far from the end. His legacy was alive, not just in the buildings or programs, but in the countless lives he had touched. And as long as there was a need, as long as there were people willing to care, Marcus knew that the ripples of hope he had set into motion would never stop.